Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 and one for 30, and it's your job to draw the image that you see. Lizet will be joining us today. She'll be doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow her advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Once it's finished, don't forget to post your photographs on Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this Raw Umber portrait video. This week I will be sketching in willow charcoal. For erasing I will be using a putty rubber. And for blending I will be using a paper stump. Finally, for the accents, I might end up using some compressed charcoal. So let's get started. The first thing I like to do is get the center line in, and this is the line that goes from the forehead all the way to the chin. Now I am using a system called Comparative Measurements here, meaning I decide on the length of the face and then compare that to the width on the picture and then on my paper. As you can see, you can use the tip of your pencil or your charcoal as the top of the measurement, and then you can use your thumb to indicate where the end is of the measurement, and this way you can compare various elements of the drawing to one another. In this case, I see the length being equal to the height, so I can just draw a box shape. Now when drawing portraits, there are some proportional rules that you can use to enhance your accuracy. The first one is that the corners of the eyes will be at a point located halfway from the chin to the top of the forehead. Another thing that's useful is to find the midpoint. The way I like to do that is by drawing a cross from each corner of the box, and this is the midpoint of the box of the skull and is the point where the jawline starts, and the ear will sit right behind that. Finally, if you take that eye line across, that is also where the back of the skull is located. Another really useful measurement is the rule of thirds. So the bottom of the chin to the bottom of the nose to the brow line to the forehead are all equal spaces. Next, I like to look at angles. So for instance, comparing the angle of the forehead to the imaginary straight line of the central line. And if we lay our charcoal or pencil across that, it's very easy to see how it differs. And as you can see, the forehead recedes, the eye sockets are also receding, the nose protrudes, and the chin is also slightly receding. And this is really useful when you're looking for likeness, because you can play with this. Some people have a chin that sticks out or a forehead that's more square. So this can do a lot for the likeness. Next I can add in the shoulders, trying to look for the angles and the straight lines. And for the ear, it's important to notice that it sits between the bottom of the nose and the top of the brow. Make sure it's at a slight angle. So as you can see in the image, he has a bit of hair sticking out of the top of that box. So I'm just going to add that in. So now we have a skull with some features that we can start to add some detail to. For instance, a very obvious one is the hair. Make sure that you add the hair on top of the skull, because of course it has some volume and won't be flat on top of that skull. For the hairline, it's important to note that there's always a little square of hair just in front of the ear. Then the hair follows the arch of the outside of the brow, goes inwards, and then is pretty much straight at the top. Now let's break down the lips. So what I'd like to do is take the bottom half of the face, so the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin, and divide that into 3 thirds, with the first third being the top of the chin and the second line being the middle of the lips. And once I have that, still using an imaginary straight line as my guide, I look at how much the lips stick out from that middle line, or maybe they recede, and I check the angles as well. So for instance, we can see that the top lip sticks out the most, a bit further than the chin and a bit further than the second lip. And then we have the bottom lip sticking out a bit further than the chin. And then finally we have the chin. So this is another great way to find likeness. And just comparing things that straight line can be really useful. For instance, if I play with that a little bit and I put his lips behind that line, you straight away get a completely different character. Same thing as if I would take the bottom lip and then protrude that out further than the top lip. Again, you get a completely different character there. So just looking at that center line and comparing how these elements compare in terms of how far they stick out and the angles of them can really help with the likeness. So that's it for the 10-minute pose. In the next pose, I'm going to start looking at shadow shapes. So I'm now going to start the same way, first by placing the top and bottom on the page and find that center line. The eyes will be in the middle of the face, just like in the first pose, and make sure that you're already checking the angle here, because it's not entirely horizontal. And then next I can find the 3 thirds again, chin to the bottom of the nose to top of the brow. The widest point will be the cheekbones here, and when I check it, it seems pretty much the same as the bottom of the nose to the top of the brow. And again, you can compare the width of the forehead to the width of those cheekbones, and I see that pretty much in line, so he's got a bit of a heart-shaped face. And again, this is something that can really help with the likeness. And feel free to make some adjustments here. Maybe he's got a wider chin, maybe he's got more narrow cheekbones, but this is a place where you can still play with the shape of the face. So now we have these big proportions in, I want to jump straight to drawing shadow shapes. For instance, I see his hairline merging into the shadow on the side of his skull. Occupying about 2/3 of his forehead and going up to the brow line. So once I have that, I'm just going to give a light shade in that area. And remember in the first pose that we saw that the eye socket was receding. Well, with that in mind, I'm just going to shade that whole ridge below the brow, and later I can cut in here with the rubber. So try to keep a very light touch at this stage of the drawing. Same thing for the side of his face. I'm just going to shade that in and keep it very simple. And now you're pretty much happy with the big skull here, with its big shadow shapes on top. We can start looking at the next biggest shape. And this is of course the nose. And you can imagine the nose has sort of V shape, going inwards towards the tip of the nose. And then you can imagine it's a wedge shape. Now I did do a nose only session a few sessions back, so if you have a subscription, feel free to have a look at that if you need a little recap. But for now, the main thing to remember is that the light is coming from the top left, and therefore that wedge shape is casting a shadow on the rest of the face. For the mouth, again, I like to divide it into 3/3. And note that I'm not really including the hair on the chin here. I'm looking at the bone structure rather than the hair. And because the lips protrude as well, you can see there's a little bit of shadow underneath the bottom lip and a little bit of shadow on top of the top lip. And note that the outlines of my edges are the darkest, and I don't really put any detail inside the shadow. And this is because that outside edge, which is called the core shadow or even a terminator, is the most descriptive part of the drawing. But we'll see more about that in the 30-minute pose. In the meantime, let's start breaking down the eye sockets. Now you can imagine that eyeball as a sphere tucked inside that ridge of the brow. So I'd like to lightly draw these spheres in and then put the big shadow shape of the brow on top. And then you can surround these eyeballs with the eyelids. I tend to draw the top lid in more prominently because it is the lid that's the biggest and the most movable. And feel free to take some time adjusting some of the drawing if you're not quite happy with the way it's looking. And of course, if you're watching this live, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me anything you like in a chat. In the meantime, I'm going to take my stump. And if you don't have a stump, a Q-tip or even your finger or piece of tissue will work just as well. And I'm going to go around the edges of my shadow. And this will soften them up very slightly. So you might find you're losing a little bit of the drawing here. But don't worry, we'll get that back in a second. And what this does is it makes the form feel like it's going round. And I like to take my darker charcoal here. So in my case, that is a Peel and Sketch charcoal pencil. And because it's a bit darker, it doesn't really erase, much like the willow charcoal does. So I can go over all of the edges and reinstate and make the shapes a little bit more precise, and then go over with my stump again. So for instance, in the forehead, I go in with my darker charcoal pencil and I draw in that round form of the forehead. And then I can take my stump and gently blend that in. And again, I can do that with the ridge of the brow, where the shadow shapes makes a turn. I can first put that in with my darker charcoal, and then blend with the stump. And the more you do this, the more precise your shapes will be and the better the likeness. For something tricky like the mustache, try to only hint at it at the start of the shadow, so make it a bit more hairy, but try not to draw it equally all around the mouth, because then it can start looking a little bit fake. Instead, I tried to focus on the edges of the shapes only. So I've done a bit on the stache, and now I'm doing a bit on the bottom of the chin, and I'm trying to connect these up, but I actually don't connect them all together. And even if you don't, you can see that your eye just fills in the middle. And this can look really nice in terms of letting the viewer do a bit of the work. So instead of spelling out where exactly that beard is located, try letting the viewer connect the dots. And this can feel really counterintuitive, but give it a go and try it out. And I think you'll find your brain will just connect the two ends up. And this technique, I like to think of it in the same way as telling a story. So it's much more engaging for your audience to hint at parts of the story rather than really spell them out. And it's the same way in drawing. So note as well, for instance, that with the hairline, I'm hinting a little bit at the start of it, but as I get into the shadow, I don't put anything in there. So let's move on to the eyes for a little bit again. Make sure to emphasize that roundness of the sphere. And for the iris and the pupils, all you have to do is put another sphere inside of those. Now I did do an eye only session a few sessions back. So again, if you'd like to recap that, feel free to visit that video after this one. But for now, what I try to do is add a little bit more detail, then jump around the picture and add a bit more detail in another area. And this really helps with making sure that I don't get too stuck in one particular area, and instead I can go from the eyes to the mouth with a fresh eye. And as I progress on the eyes, for instance, I try to repeat the technique that I used before. So adding some accents using the darker charcoal and then blending them in using the stump. And as I do this more and more, the drawing will get more detailed. So I'm just going to continue doing this all around the rest of the face. And I keep trying to keep my detail on the very edge of the shadow rather than inside of it. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. Otherwise, I will see you at the 30-minute pose. So for the last pose, we're going to combine the knowledge we have from the side view in a 10-minute pose and the shadow shapes that we learned in the 20-minute pose. So I'm going to start with the box shape, making sure that I know where the bottom and the top of the skull will be, placing the eyes in the middle and really looking at the angle again. So you can see that the eye that's closest towards us is a bit higher than the other eye. Now just placing the 2/3, making sure that they're at the same angle as the eyes. Now just finding the midpoint of the skull, and that's the place where we can start the jawline. And next, looking at the angles of the eye socket, the forehead, and the other angles and how they relate to that center line. For the mouth, I divide the chin into 3/3 again, with the first line being the top of the chin and the second line being the dividing line of the lips. Again, the ear will be between the bottom of the nose and the top of the brow. And now I'm pretty happy with the skull. I can start adding the hair on top. And while I'm doing the hairline, like I said in the 10-minute pose, the little square of hair is in front of the ear. Then there's an angle that follows the angle of the brow. So while I'm doing that, I might as well just shade in the main planes. And then I can continue on the hairline, making sure it matches up with that corner of the brow. When doing the hairline, make sure you really emphasize that the forehead is going inwards into that hairline. So there's a bit of overlap going on. And again, this helps avoid that sort of glued on look that sometimes you can get with hair. Now I can just start adding all of my big shadow shapes. I try to use the least amount of lines as possible, so really working from big to small. And what I'm doing here is related to the planes of the face. And if you'd like to study these a bit more, we do have a 3D library. And one of these is a head showing the planes of the face. And that might be useful if you're a little bit confused as to how these planes work. And once I've got that big shadow shape in, I can start looking at the bigger shapes within that. So for instance, the nose is catching some light. So I'm just going to figure out the shape of that. And then I can go in with my rubber and erase some of that light. Same thing around the mouth, the top lip. You can see there's some light entering the shadow there. So I'm just going to draw that out and then erase into that shadow shape. And because we don't put a lot of information in the shadow with this technique, really keep an eye out for overlaps. So note that, for instance, the top lip is overlapping the bottom lip. So I'm really going to make sure I emphasize that, because even a little information goes a long way. For the eyes, just like in the 20-minute pose, I like to imagine or sketch in the spheres of the eyeballs. And then I can add the top lid on top. And again, keep an eye out for overlaps. The top lid is a bit thicker and lays on top of the eyeball, so therefore needs to stick out a bit further. So now I've got everything in. I'm going to go in using the same technique that we used in the 20-minute pose, going in with a darker charcoal and then blending that out using the stump. And really try to look at the edges of the shadow here. So for instance, he's wearing some pretty cool earrings and they are casting a shadow on his jawline, and you can see how crisp that shadow is. And if you compare that to, for instance, the shadow on his cheekbone, you can see that's a lot more diffused. So I'm going to constantly try to emphasize those differences in shadow. So for instance, with a stash, it's kind of hard to see where the shadow starts. So I'm going to really blend it out and make it kind of messy, so it's hard to see on my picture as well. As always, if you see any issues with the drawing, feel free to refine that first. The drawing is always the most important part, and everything we do on top of that is great, but the drawing is always the structure that's underneath. You can compare that to, for instance, the foundation of a house. You can start hanging up paintings, but if the walls are crumbling down, that's not really going to get you anywhere. So you have to make sure that the structural elements are in place, and then you can start decorating. For this eye, again, I'm going to go in with my darker charcoal and just adding in that sphere of the pupil and the iris. And make sure that the top lid slightly overlaps it, and this just makes sure that it feels natural and calm. And as I work on the edge of the shadow, I try to relate it to that sharp shadow that we spoke about a few minutes ago that is cast by the earring. So we can see that while the forehead is pretty clear, it's not quite as sharp as that shadow. So instead of putting a line along the form, I'm going to zigzag across, and this helps with making it a little bit more clear without making it really sharp. And you can see that as you do this, that core shadow near the light gets darker and darker. And this is something that actually happens in shadows. As they turn further away from the light, they get a little bit lighter. But if you find that they're getting a bit too light, feel free to just glaze over them a little bit. So I'm now just going to work my way down, working on the outside edge, that border between the dark and the light. I'm going to try and make that more specific, and I'm going to constantly try to relate that to the cast shadow of the earring. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments if you're watching this live. When doing the light area on the nose, try to really look at which area is the lightest. So since the light is coming from the left, within that light shape, the left side will be lighter compared to the dark right side. So I tend to use the stump here and just get a big gradient going. And then I just pick out the highlights using the rubber. And these sort of big gradients can really help with making sure that you get some form in your drawing. So it really starts looking like this area is close to the light and this area is going away from the light. So it helps with making your drawing feel more 3D. Again, with the beard, feel free to add a big gradient and to play with the edges of the beard, but try not to just connect it up using one big scribble, because that can make the beard feel a little bit flat. So instead, what I try to do is just look at the edge between light and dark again, and instead of making it smooth, I'm going to make the edge a bit hairy. And as you can see, this starts feeling like a believable beard. And this is really the magic of shadow shapes. You can not put any information inside of them, but if you work on the edge alone, you can really get a lot of information in there. And as you can see, this stage is a lot of what I call back and forth. Sometimes I add a bit, then I think it's a bit too much, then I take it out again, just until I feel like things are just clicking in. So I think we're almost at the end of the 30-minute pose. So I'm just gonna keep finishing my drawing. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the chat if you're watching this live. So that's the end of the 30-minute pose. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope that you feel like you've learned something. If you use Instagram, feel free to tag your work using the hashtag #RawUmberLive. We always love to see what you're coming up with.
Thank you for taking part. I'd like to thank Lizet for joining us today as well. Don't forget to photograph your work, post them on Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 p.m. You can find out more details on our website, rawumberstudios.com.